Welcome to the Elevate Your Brand podcast, where we help online coaches learn how to elevate their brand, become the experts in their industries so they can bring in more clients and create a life they want. I am your host, Chris Anderson. And if you want to make a difference in the lives of others, share this episode, go over to Apple Podcasts and follow us there to leave a positive rating and review. And together we can leave a bigger positive mark on the world. Welcome back to Elevate Your Brand. I'm Chris Anderson, your host. Today we're diving into how to host an interview recording or a roundtable and how to do it successfully and do it well. I'm going to go over 5 things that are going to help you with your virtual interview, your in-person interview, or roundtable discussion. These 5 things are one, have an outline of the discussion beforehand. Number 2, let the guest speak, but know when to interrupt and how to do it. 3, verify any boundaries that you don't want to cross. 4, dig deeper. And number 5, make sure to thank them and follow up with them. So for the first tip, outlining the discussion beforehand, but being flexible with the discussion. So you want to have some sort of idea and guidelines for the interview, for the discussion, because you want to have a little bit of structure so people know, especially with a roundtable with multiple people, you want them to understand the premise of the interview, of the recording, what it's mainly about, and some main topics you would like to hit on. So with an outline, it's very loose. It's a high level where then you can go and you can ask different things during it, but you have some sort of a direction with the interview, with the roundtable that's going to help guide all of that and have an understanding with everyone involved what the recording is going to be about. Number 2, letting the guest or guests speak, but knowing when to interject properly or interrupt properly. So we might have all had that guest that we've talked to that just goes on and on with an answer or response. And that can get boring for the listener because sometimes they get off tangent, they go down a rabbit hole, and it doesn't make sense. So there's a line where you let them talk without interrupting to get their response and get their story or their opinion on the matter. But once you see it going off the rails or going down that rabbit hole, you've got to be able to politely interject and direct them and position them back on track with the conversation. So you can do that. You can do something just, hey, I hate to interrupt, but I noticed you said this right there. Can we dive into that a little bit more? Or I like what you just said right there. Can we pause just a second? You said this, and then dig into it. Because if you let them continue to talk, they'll just keep going and you won't get to the meat of the episode that you wanted to do in your outline. That's number 2. Number 3 is you want to verify any boundaries that you do not want to cross during this interview or discussion. So if it's someone that there may be some controversy around their story or around things they've done, or just in general, maybe they're a high profile person or anyone really, asking them ahead of time, hey, this is the outline. This is the premise of the recording. I would like to ask certain things. Your life, X, Y, and Z. You might already know those. So you say, is that okay to touch on? Is there anything that you do not want us to touch on? And they'll know. And do this beforehand, say it through email or even a pre-call. Oh yeah, that's completely fine. Nothing's off limits. Okay, great. That's great to know. Or they might say, yeah, hey, please don't touch on this part of my journey. I'm not ready to speak on it, or X, Y, and Z. So that'll help you not have any awkward moments on the camera, on the recording, especially if you're doing live, where you say something and they're like, no, we're not talking about that. Or you could do that depending on the direction you want to take to make engaging like post about, yeah, and they just completely shut me off. But more or less, you're going to be respectful about their story and what they don't want. So the 4th thing is to dig deeper. So a lot of the times, and I'm still working on this too and improving this part, is where you're interviewing someone, you're having the discussion with them, and they have a great response to your question you asked. But we're almost too quick to take that next step down the interview road. So instead, if we can take a second to think and respond instead of just be ready to respond, what did they just say and how can we dig a little bit deeper? Hate him or love him, I was just actually listening to Howard Stern, one of his videos, and he asked a question to his guest and the guest responded, answered the question. But in that, they had mentioned that they were working with another actor and how that person was. And just a little quick side note on their story. But Howard, instead of going right to the next thing that he probably had on his list, he just leans forward and said, well, that's a fascinating story. You mentioned this person and what it was like to work with them. Let's dig into that. Or tell me more about that. And then he guided
the person he was speaking to talk about that. And you're going to get more value from those persons when you can dig deeper and segue off of their answer with kind of getting more into the meat, because everyone has their canned superficial answers that they talk about all the time. But if you can take one thing and dig deeper on the topic, you're going to get something new and fresh that maybe someone else hasn't, or maybe that they haven't said yet, that no one's heard, that's going to resonate more with the audience because it is new and fresh from that individual. So if you can dig deeper and then bring it back to the main path of the interview, you're going to get a better response from the person you're interviewing and those listening. And the fifth is to thank the guest or guests that have been on your show that you're interviewing for their time, because they've given you time, which is the most valuable resource we have to share. So make sure you're thanking them. Be grateful that they shared with you and your audience, and make sure then to follow up afterward. Again, being appreciative, saying another thank you, letting them know when the episode's going to come out, giving them maybe content or assets that they can share to their audience that makes them look good. Because no guest wants to get something that they're supposed to share that is more about the show they were on versus themselves. But if you give them content that's more about themselves, that makes them look good, they're going to be more apt to share it on their social media platform and give you the credit. And that's going to be more beneficial. So think about that when you're creating the content and following up with them. And then when you're following up with them, if this person was someone who could be a client of yours or something of that nature, continue to give. So then when you follow up, it opens the door easier to, hey, I know we talked about this, or you said this or mentioned these things. That's something we do. I'd love to have that conversation. It's much easier to take someone you've already talked to and built a little bit of rapport with and that you've given value to and followed up with, to then say, hey, I know you mentioned this. We solve that. If you're ever open to having that conversation, I would love to do that. So just opens up the door with having to thank you and follow-ups. So these are the 5 things that you can do to improve your interview videos, your interview recordings, and your roundtable discussions if you have those, and be a better interviewer, create better content, and again, elevate your brand. So go out there, implement, take action, elevate what you're doing, and we'll talk next time.
And thanks so much for tuning into this episode today. If you found value at all from this episode, please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It just helps us get this show, these messages out in front of more people. And don't forget to share this with someone who you think could benefit from listening to as well.